Welcome, everyone, and welcome to the PSI Merit Conference on the Power of Community, a conversation where we're looking to understand how we can build inclusive networks of research and support. Before we begin, I think it's appropriate for us to recognize where McMaster is situated and where I'm speaking from is the traditional territories of Mississauga and Haudenosaunee. It's the land protected under the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. As we talked earlier in the morning during our opening plenary, it's important for us to understand how we connect and integrate into our communities. What's the source and author of our questions, and how do we prioritize knowledge? How do we share that? What does it mean when we speak and integrate and connect with scholars and with communities that are First Nation? I think we should take just a moment to pause and reflect about what are our own work as scholars and as consumers of research. How does it connect with the First Nation communities that we are integrated into, that we're a part of, and what does it mean for our own academic practice? I want to thank PSI, the Physician Services Incorporated Foundation, for providing us an unrestricted educational grant to fund this conference. This is the third year in a row, and we're very pleased for the support that they have provided for us. At our closing panel, you'll hear more about the work of PSI when my co-chair, Dr. Deborah Cook, speaks. And so we'll have an opportunity to understand a little bit more about the work that PSI is doing to support education and research across the province. It's my great pleasure to welcome for our second keynote address of this conference, Dr. Karen Hauer. Dr. Hauer is a professor of medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, where she also serves as the Associate Dean of Competency Assessment and Professional Standards. She has a very active research portfolio, and I followed her own research with a lot of interest. And whenever a publication comes forward from her, it's flagged for me, and I quickly want to consume it and think, man, what a great idea. And what insightful analysis, and so frequently it starts to impact my own work as a researcher and my own work as an educator and teacher. Her focus has been on competency-based medical education, learner assessment, equity and assessment, coaching and remediation. She has served in a number of national community leadership roles, including the National Board of Medical Examiners, on the Medical Education Journal as a deputy editor, and is the past president of the Clerkship Directors in Internal Medicine. We are also quite fortunate to welcome as a respondent or a discussant for Dr. Hauer's presentation, Dr. Lara Varpio. Dr. Varpio is a professor of medicine and the associate director of research for the Center for Health Professions Education at the Uniformed Service University of the Health Professions. Dr. Varpio has won a number of awards for her work in medical education and health professions education research, most notably an inaugural Karolinska Fellowship. We're also quite pleased to have Dr. Varpio as an adjunct merit scientist. So with that, I would like to turn over the platform to Dr. Hauer to challenge us to think about stronger together, building an inclusive research network. Dr. Hauer.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me. I will begin by sharing my screen here. Is that the right view for you all?
Looks great.
Great. So I really want to thank you for inviting me to speak about this really important and impactful topic. I'm honored and humbled that you would think of me for this, and I've learned a lot in preparing for today's session. I am located in San Francisco, where we often hear from applicants or colleagues at other institutions that we're in such a liberal and progressive city that we must really have things figured out related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm here to tell you that we don't, but we are committed to the journey and the hard work that it will take to realize our vision of being inclusive, anti-oppressive, and welcoming of all. To frame my approach to inclusive research networks, I want to share a bit more about myself and the perspectives that I bring. You heard that I trained at UCSF. I was an internal medicine clerkship director before my current role as an associate dean. I have a lot of research interests, and I'm really passionate about building research teams. My other identities include that I'm a white, cisgender, heterosexual, and able-bodied woman. I'm married to an anesthesiologist who was my medical school classmate, and I'm a mom of 3 kids. So I think there are real limitations to my perspectives, and I need to collaborate with others. To prepare for this talk, I polled research colleagues, including multiple trainees who I've worked with and mentored, and asked them their definition of inclusive research networks. And I've incorporated their input into my comments today. There are many problems that we need to tackle, and I've listed some important concepts here on this slide. In research, we're often told that we need to ask good questions and use the right research methods to answer those questions. But today we'll focus on another key factor to be successful in research: building the right research teams. As physicians and educators, we try to identify pressing problems, but if we think differently through an equity and social justice lens, we think not only about what are the problems, but who are the populations most affected by these problems, and who is qualified to weigh in. In academics, we value expertise, credentials, publications. With that lens, we may be leaving important voices out. Who are the individuals with lived experience to help us identify important questions and contribute to studying and answering those questions? Our literature is shaped historically mostly by white individuals, white men. This white centering can hold us back. Inclusive research networks help us to shift and broaden the lens through which we identify and attempt to answer important questions. I've organized my comments today using 3 examples from research that I've been involved with to emphasize 3 important aspects of inclusive research networks. First, inclusivity. Second, engagement. And third, rethinking power and expertise. Inclusivity can help us understand and address things differently. And I will use the example from our own work at UCSF on clerkship grading. At UCSF, like many institutions, we've placed strong emphasis on diversity, recruiting diverse medical students to strengthen our medical training programs. And we've been successful. Our current first-year class includes over half students from backgrounds underrepresented in medicine. Despite this progress, though, we found through our work on clerkship grading that we were still advancing our students using an approach based on meritocratic principles. Who had the highest scores or grades, and how did that shape our view of excellence? As we've moved through our research program, we've shifted our focus toward being more inclusive. Many programs, including our own, use holistic admissions, looking not only at candidates' metrics, but also their attributes and experiences that they will bring to the learning and patient care community. To be inclusive, once we've admitted those students to our program or those residents to our residency programs, we've been forced to look at our policies and how those interfere with our ability to create an inclusive learning environment. We have subsequently changed our policies and worked on our learning environment and curriculum, including assessment, to truly be an inclusive, anti-oppressive institution. Our work on clerkship grading was galvanized by a comment from a student in our medical school years ago who spoke to us and said that it appeared to him that the students selected for the AOA Medical Honor Society at our school were more white and less diverse than the class as a whole. We took this feedback seriously and formed a research team to analyze our own data, to look in the mirror. And our findings are summarized here. Over a 4-year period, students from backgrounds not underrepresented in medicine, as shown in the bottom row on this slide, earned average clerkship scores 1/10 of a point higher than the students who were from backgrounds underrepresented in medicine. We felt that this 1/10 of a point difference was unlikely to be educationally or clinically meaningful. However, it led students from backgrounds not underrepresented in medicine to be about twice as likely to earn clerkship honors grades and over 3 times as likely to be selected for the AOA Alpha Omega Alpha Medical Honor Society. We called these findings representative of an amplification cascade in which very small differences in assessed performance, concerning for unconscious bias, led to very large differences in grades and honors, the drivers of academic careers and selection to the most competitive residencies and specialties. For us, this information helped us truly take transformative action around the problems with clerkship grading and to study the impact of those changes. For many years, since I was a medical student, students have complained that clerkship grading is unfair. This process interferes with their learning as they focus more on performing and looking good rather than asking questions and revealing what they don't know. And all of this takes a toll on their well-being during a year that they should be excited to be caring for patients full-time for the first time in their training. For us at UCSF, we worked for years on trying to improve clerkship grading, but our equity findings led us to take a totally different approach. As we changed our system of assessment to focus on learning and feedback over scoring and performance, we aimed to study our changes, and this created an opportunity to build an inclusive research network. At the same time, we were defining what is excellent differently than in the past. Inclusion entails creating an organizational culture that allows all people, regardless of background, to thrive and contribute to decision-making. This slide shows students who all led some research projects evaluating our change in approach to clerkship assessment. Many of our faculty, experienced educators and clinicians, worried that if we moved away from honors grades and focused on feedback and growth, that we would be giving up on excellence and losing our ability to identify the best and the brightest. And we have really challenged that narrative and emphasized that inclusion and excellence are mutually reinforcing. By including all voices at the table and allowing all learners to grow and develop, we will create a larger and more diverse physician population prepared to care for our patients. And in that way, we have aimed to transform the culture at UCSF. This slide shows the series of studies that we've conducted looking at our change in clerkship assessment and grading. It's really wonderful to see that all of these were first authored by trainees. We started on the upper left by examining the perceptions of students at 6 institutions around the fairness and accuracy of clerkship grading. And we found the problems that we heard at UCSF were paralleled by students around our country. Subsequent studies included evaluating student outcomes of the change in approach to assessment and grading in qualitative and quantitative ways, exploring the faculty experience of this change, taking a deep dive into what characterizes equity in assessment, and exploring the use of a work-based assessment tool to enhance the focus on feedback and assessment for learning. For the 3 examples I'll share today, I want to include some aha moments that I personally experienced. Around our efforts to study our clerkship assessment and grading change, I learned that the moral imperative around diversity is strong in our culture in San Francisco. However, we realized that change is not just at the individual level. We really needed to align our structures and policies with what we say we value. And secondly, examining our own data to uncover what we believe is at least in part due to unconscious bias with differences in scores for students based on race ethnicity. That was really a hard process, and subsequent to our own publication, other institutions have done the same analysis and found the same thing. and experienced the hard process of admitting that there are these discrepancies that need to be addressed. I'll wrap up each of my 3 examples with recommendations. To create an inclusive research network focused on inclusivity, invite diverse team members to participate in the research. Qualifications aren't just credentials and training, but also life experiences and perspectives. The trainees that I polled about their definition of an inclusive research network emphasized the importance of appreciating each team member as an individual by truly welcoming them and knowing them as individuals. How do they want to be referred to? How do they pronounce their name? What makes them unique individuals? Checking in with them each time the team meets. Trainees also emphasize that they feel included when they're set up for success. Clarifying what their roles are and expectations is crucial for them to be successful. Providing resources based on where they're at and what they need to learn helps them participate. And they want to be confident that they can get their questions answered to feel that they can move forward as part of the team. The second example that I'll share emphasizes engagement as part of an inclusive research network, focusing on how to build on people's lived experiences. The example that I'll share here addresses studies that we've done on microaggressions. We learned through our work on clerkship assessment and grading that part of the reason that students might be assessed differently is that they experience the learning environment and their interactions with supervising residents and faculty differently depending on their background. Our students and students elsewhere report that microaggressions are very common in the clinical learning environment. An example is shown on this slide, someone saying, "No, where are you really from?" Discounting what they have to contribute and focusing on how they might be different than other providers in the environment. Our first study on microaggressions was titled "Walking on Eggshells: Faculty Response to Microaggressions Targeting Clinical Learners." We knew that microaggressions occur, and we were interested in how to intervene. To understand this question, we asked, what do students feel are the key features of an ideal supervisor response to microaggressions targeting students? And how do faculty respond to these microaggressions? We were hoping to use this research to develop training materials for our faculty. This question arose through a deep dive that we took into our clerkship grading discrepancies. With the data that I shared earlier, we used a quality improvement approach and did this root cause analysis with a fishbone diagram. And a schematic of it is shown here. We identified that causes and consequences of lower assessed performance in students from backgrounds underrepresented in medicine were partially related to student factors as shown in the upper left, but also a lot of the reasons that students might be differentially assessed have more to do with their faculty and resident supervisors shown in the upper right, or on the bottom, clinical learning environment features or school policies and procedures. The factors shown in the lighter blue affect all students and contribute to that general feeling that clerkship grading is unfair. The factors shown in dark blue disproportionately and negatively affect students from backgrounds underrepresented in medicine. One factor that we chose to study with our microaggressions project is the common occurrence of microaggressions. To understand microaggressions, we needed a diverse team. Our students helped us understand what were typical microaggressions that they encountered every day, both in medical school and really through their whole life. Our team is shown here. We asked students to help us build our research materials by creating microaggression scenarios. So building on their lived experiences, they helped us create scenarios that we would use to present to students in focus groups to ask them how faculty typically respond and how they would want faculty respond to optimize their learning. We asked these focus group participants to identify faculty who were especially skilled at responding to microaggressions, and then we engaged those faculty as well as other faculty that we term general to do focus groups with faculty to hear about their experience with microaggressions. Out of this work, we created a bystander microaggression intervention guide that we've used with our faculty at UCSF in trainings. One of our big findings was the importance of a pre-brief. We use this term to describe the discussion that students want faculty to have before a microaggression even occurs. Students told us, based on their lived experiences, that they've been seeing these types of insults their whole life. So they know more than the faculty about how they would want people to respond. Faculty have multiple options based on this discussion: to bear witness, to intervene, or to pause and have the team exit the room. Our students also emphasized the individual preferences they have around what to do after the microaggression, discussing individually with the student, having a team debrief, making sure that that conversation is focused on the student and not on the performative way that some supervisors might want to respond in a way that puts the focus on them rather than the microaggression and the learner experience. Aha moments for me around engagement through our study of microaggressions are first to listen. I needed to learn to be curious about students' experiences in order to be a helpful participant in this research. I also learned, as I already knew, that it's very hard to talk about racism, intersectionality of different identities, and oppression. Our faculty find this hard, and there's an ongoing need for skills development and practice. Engagement in inclusive research involves thinking about whose voices are at the table and whose voices are missing. How can we engage the voices that we need? By creating legitimate roles, providing resources for all members of the research team, and giving and asking for feedback. How to get started begins with inviting a collaborator and thinking outside of the group of usual suspects. For me, that meant thinking beyond the people that I usually work with or whose articles I'm used to reading, and then elevating and empowering those individuals. One success factor that's worked really well with trainees is encouraging mentoring within the team. So even if I'm the person who launched the team or has the most research experience, I don't need to be the only mentor. It's been really rewarding to see trainees mentor other trainees or junior faculty mentor trainees, kind of in a family generational style. And in this way, I think that we've achieved aspects of communities of practice as defined by Levin Wenger. Mutual engagement means that there are interactions and relationships within the team and between the team and the research participants. Joint enterprise entails working together with a common goal, really this vision of diversity, equity, and inclusion in an anti-oppressive environment at UCSF. At our institution, people are eager to take concrete steps toward that goal. Shared repertoire, sharing resources. Students really emphasize how they feel personally valued and included by receiving a useful article about the research methods. Some of the things that they felt were most inclusive might have seemed a bit basic or impersonal to me, but it really helps them feel like they're part of the team. And of course, sharing stories. Narrative is critically important when thinking about inclusion, when thinking about anti-oppression, understanding the lived experiences and the histories that are different from our own. I'll wrap up this section with my recommendations around engagement as part of creating an inclusive research network. At every step of the research process, facilitate team members' participation. Trainees told me that they really value advanced agendas so that they can be prepared. Whereas it might be easy for a more senior faculty to speak on the fly, the trainees want to think about what we're going to discuss so that they can prepare themselves. Trainees really like to lead the agenda, and I think that's an important way to counteract the hierarchical nature of many research teams. And the trainees I spoke with said that they really value using things like Box. That's our cloud sharing system at UCSF, so that everyone has access to study resources. Another tip is to provide dissemination opportunities. The trainees that I've worked with haven't necessarily valued presenting at the biggest name conference that I might think of. There are a lot of conferences focused on trainees or more niche groups that trainees have found to be really helpful to build their network and their confidence. The third example I'll share is ongoing work we're doing around rethinking power and expertise to help us understand and address oppressive structures. And the example that I'll use here is ongoing work that we're doing with our new UCSF Racial and Sociopolitical Trauma Protocol. This protocol arose based on student request to acknowledge and provide time and space for students after upsetting racist national events. The murder of George Floyd in 2020 is an example of such an event that causes real trauma and harm to some members of our community more so than others. So this racial and socio-political trauma protocol in our medical school provides a coordinated, comprehensive institutional response to incidents of racial and socio-political trauma. And it affords students the space to process these events. For some students, that might mean taking time off, spending time with their community, attending a rally or a protest. Students can define individually what helps them process. And at the same time, the protocol is designed to make sure that students still can progress to graduation requirements on time and meet our medical school competencies. So one of our ongoing studies is looking at what is the impact of a medical school racial and socio-political trauma protocol. Our study team is shown here. We're using mixed methods to quantify students' use of the protocol. What curricular events did they choose to defer or opt out of based on the parameters of the protocol, and who was using the protocol? And then we're using focus groups to explore the experience among students, faculty, and staff. One of the early lessons in designing this study, in which we initially focused on students and faculty, was the critical role that our staff play in implementing something within our curriculum. Thus, we added 2 staff members to this research team and added focus groups with staff. That was an area where I learned about being more inclusive. This study and the implementation of the protocol emphasizes the importance of cultural humility, the way that an important national event affects some members of our community might be very different than for others. Cultural humility requires ongoing self-reflection and commitment to ongoing learning. We've had to realize that many of us have major limitations to our own perspective. We need to keep asking our students and other faculty, what is this like for you? With a perspective of curiosity and openness to what they have to say. The aha moments in studying this racial and socio-political trauma protocol for me were, first of all, the real toll of racial trauma. Some individuals have been living with this trauma and experiencing it without others even knowing. Drawing out those experiences and really listening has helped expand my understanding. And secondly, an aha moment here is around the importance of shared voice and ownership. As a member of our Dean's leadership team, I was viewing the implementation of the protocol as the responsibility of the administration. And it's true that we do have an important role in implementing this protocol. But the students, right from the beginning, We're viewing this as something that they had initiated and something that they wanted presented as a joint venture between students and faculty. I think that's a really excellent way to rethink hierarchies and to engage community in important work, both from a administrative perspective and a research perspective. I thought about sustainability in thinking about inclusive research networks, and also in relation to this protocol, which we are continuing to use within our curriculum. Sustaining a research network or an important systems initiative require the right support, both funding and creation of organizational capacity. Who's going to have this within their job description, and how will they be supported in having the skills that they need and the time that they need to do this work well? Our racial and sociopolitical trauma protocol depends upon partnership. Faculty, administration, staff, and students must work together to make this protocol possible. And finally, once you've implemented something, the work is not done. Each time we implement this protocol, we have a debrief so that we can find out where we might iteratively improve the process so that we can continue to make this protocol satisfying for the individuals that it's most intended to serve. My recommendations regarding rethinking power and expertise when creating an inclusive research network are, first of all, to attend to the whole person. The protocol is designed to give people the space that they need to keep themselves whole. As faculty and mentors, we should model and encourage self-care and vacation. When our learners see us working all the time, they think, gee, I really don't want to be that person. When we involve learners in research, it's important to encourage them to prioritize their academics. We first want them to advance in their training program before we want them to engage in research. I'll speak more about the minority tax coming up here. Another recommendation is to value the input of each research team member while also respecting where they're at. Sometimes they need more help. They need to feel comfortable asking a question. Sometimes they need to stay silent and it's not a good time for them to participate. That's okay too. Inviting individuals' personal learning goals allows faculty to tailor what they're offering to where the learner is at. And finally, the importance of reflection. When I surveyed students and residents that I've worked with about inclusive research networks, several of them mentioned how much they've really enjoyed the concept of reflexivity. I do a lot of qualitative research, and they found that those discussions about reflexivity have strengthened our teams as well as strengthened our research. Discussions about what perspectives each of us bring, what's surprising in the data, what we expected to see, really help us do better research and also understand each team member better. I want to share some cautions in designing inclusive research networks. The minority tax was mentioned in the earlier session today, and I think it's important to bring up here. Individuals in medical schools, residency, or faculty experience the minority tax when they're invited or appointed to be on endless committees, to speak, to coach other people. This can interfere with their ability to get the work done that they need to do clinically and in their research. In considering the minority tax, however, I think it's important to realize that participating in research is an opportunity. Being an author is a currency in academic medicine, and being on a well-designed research team can provide a lot of learning about research skills, as well as a lot of opportunity to shape dialogues in academic medicine and beyond. So we have aimed to invite diverse individuals to research teams, including those who don't have any research experience, and had frank discussions about what we think is in it for them, and invited them to share if we are accomplishing the goals that they had to learn research methods, to contribute to the conversations and be productive. A second caution I will mention is around lack of psychological safety. Once someone's invited to the team, it's important to continue to emphasize inclusion and to work against the tendency to be too hierarchical, which is common in academic medicine. The 4 stages of Clark's psychological safety model are shown here. We've been focusing on inclusion at the bottom of this graphic. But in addition, individuals on the team need to feel safe to learn, to ask the questions and admit what they don't know. The next level is safety to contribute, to share new ideas and steer the team towards certain results. And finally, at the top of the graphic, challenger safety. Psychological safety exists when someone's able to say, hey, I don't think we should do it this way. Or I think we should change what we're doing. Challenge the individual who might be higher on the institution's hierarchy embodies challenger safety. The final caution that I'll mention, although I'm sure there are more, are around blind spots and the risk of not revealing those blind spots. When we think about knowledge based on Johari's window, we can think from the upper left of this graphic about common knowledge, what we know and other people know. That's the easiest. But on an inclusive research team, we're interested in the upper right, what may not be known to me from the perspective I bring, but what's known to others that I will reveal by inviting those individuals to the research team, asking them questions and listening to their stories. On the lower left is knowledge that's known to us, but not known to others. That's where I may be able to share how we conduct a research project, how we get the resources we need to move the project forward, what literature we might want to look at. And then an ultimate goal for an inclusive research team is that we really reveal knowledge not known to us or others, as shown in the lower right. That's where our explorations together will advance our field. I'll conclude by giving overarching recommendations for building an inclusive research network. Be curious about the individuals on the team and the perspectives that they bring. This is scholarly. Next, be inclusive. Encourage all members of the community to be interested in your scholarship and find meaningful roles for them, meeting them where they're at by providing the right resources and the right support all along the way. This whole process requires that we be humble. Reflecting on what I don't know is something that I do every day. And rather than be alarmed or feel that that's something to hide, I've tried to take the approach, it's something to share. It lowers my own psychological size and it strengthens the team and its work. And finally, be ambitious. Building inclusive teams, looking for opportunities for team members to mentor others within the team or outside, and finding creative ways for dissemination advances the work and the individuals involved. And with that, I will conclude and thank you.
Thank you, Karen, so very much for what a great conversation and many things for us to think about. My hope today is that you and I will have a chance to chit chat and discuss some of these issues, but I'll also be keeping an eye along with John, who'll be helping out on the chat, to see if any of the participants in this session will have some additional questions they'd like to ask, and we'll be sure to put those forward as well. So one of the things I really wanted to start off by saying was thank you. Thank you for doing this kind of work and thinking very intentionally about issues of inclusion, equity, diversity, justice, to make sure that this is part of our research agenda in medical education. So often when it comes to research, we walk into these spaces thinking, the goal is to be objective and to engage in research in such a way that, obviously it doesn't matter who we are. Because that's not necessarily the goal of research. But as you pointed out, and as others have as well, it's so often there is no voice from nowhere. The people that we are part of the fact that we think question X is important to ask is a reflection of who we are and what we value. So I really want to thank you for engaging in this work. There were so many things in your talk that I wanted to try to touch on today. But one of the things I thought maybe we could start is if we think back to your first case, and you talked about this idea of changing the definition of what excellence is. And this is something that I've been thinking about a fair bit as well, this definition of what is success for researchers. The traditions that we work from have been, they have a tradition, they're steeped in history and one specific way of thinking. And perhaps one of the things we need to start thinking about is whether or not those definitions of success are actually definitions that are appropriate and that we want to continue to espouse and support in our modern times of thinking differently about issues of equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice. The idea that, papers, you win grant money and you put out papers, money in, papers out, is that really sort of the equation that within your research teams, for instance, we'd want to suggest is success? Or do we want to change that equation and talk more about, as we've seen in some other fields, about educating the population, but also thinking about what is it that the people for whom we are doing this research, what do they care about? Maybe that should be part of the definition of success. I'm wondering if you've had a chance to think about what you might think on that.
I love that thought. I think for the individual, shifting the definition of excellence to like, were they the first or the highest toward how much did they learn, how much did they grow, how much did they change, is important in assessment systems. In terms of scholarship, I really like your question, and numbers of publications or numbers of citations of those publications, I think, is only one narrow view of success. A learning point for me, for example, is social media. I read social media, but I don't post, and I'm not comfortable posting. And I've had this conversation with mentees who really find that valuable. And I have a lot of respect for how much conversation they generate through posting on social media. And I think that's a powerful way that you have impact and something that we should value. If it's done well, it really changes the conversation. At a local level, we've worked on, for instance, in measuring educators' success or who should be promoted, other ways of asking them, how are you disseminating your work? And often the people doing the work are best able to say, this is how I've seen my work have impact. So letting them define impact has been another success strategy.
I love that idea of asking, of putting the power back in the hands of the people who engage in the research and asking them, where it's been picked up, why don't you tell me? Which is another way of sort of starting to flatten that hierarchy of, we're going to decide what success is and thou shalt abide. Yeah. For me, I think that really resonates for me. I'm also glad to hear that you too struggle with social media. I am forever in the process of trying to figure out, is this post worthy? I don't know, I just put it out there. So I'm glad to hear that. Another piece that I was reading some journal articles the other day in preparation for a variety of things, including our chat today, and came across a manuscript that I thought maybe might be something that would help us sort of broaden our conversation as well. And it was first authored by Anna Cianciolo, so the editor of Teaching and Learning in Medicine. And it's called Physician Scientist or Basic Scientist, Exploring the Nature of a Clinician's Research Engagement. There's a lot of really important things there, but one of the points that's made in the paper is the importance for success for researchers to identify themselves as researchers, to see that as part of their professional identity. I want to congratulate you on bringing so many junior faculty and junior learners into the group. And I'm just wondering if you've seen some growth in them in terms of their identity as researchers. Do you see them taking that on, or is it more complicated depending on who those individuals are and their intersectionality pieces? I can't imagine the different kinds of situations these individuals find themselves in, and then trying to also put on the coat, wear that mantle of I'm also a researcher. I'm just interested in, perhaps you've seen, if you have any reflections on that, have you seen your learners engaging with that at all?
Definitely. I would say the first aha moment for them is often to realize that there is such a thing as medical education scholarship, that it's real, that it's rigorous, that it gets published, that it gets attention. So that's fun. And we do what we have these inquiry inspiration sessions at UCSF, and the one on medical education, we really try to showcase the learners themselves. And that draws a lot of people in, like, oh, I didn't want to work in a lab. This is a really neat new area that I hadn't thought about. The second thing is definitely letting them think about the dissemination opportunities. And I touched about that in my talk, but like student-focused conferences, they win awards, they bring me the name of the conference, they meet other students who are also like leaders in the same organization that they are at our school. So, you know, my mind might go to one of the big conferences that I attend, but really, again, trying to see the world for their lens. And then once I see that they're doing that, I'll mention it to the next trainee that I know. So I really do think they increasingly feel confidence in their ability to be a researcher, and then they'll say things like they realize that they had imposter syndrome and that it was possible to get past that through experience.
It makes me reflect on a conversation I had recently with somebody I think you know. So Justin Bullock is part of a committee that I'm on. And so we had conversations about different things. And during one of those conversations, he asked me, so what do you think I should do in this space? And at first I was really taken aback by that conversation because well, I didn't have any sort of pre-assigned sort of ideas of what he should do. So my not so informative retort was, well, just be yourself, just be you and do what you do. And I have later come to realize that was, you know, that importance of letting people be who they are, find success in the spaces where they want to engage. Be it, you know, I might think of conference X, they might think of conference Y. That's fine. But letting them take ownership of it and very explicitly giving that power. I think that resonates for me based on your experience, your comment. There's a question here from Renata Kalki. Renata is a faculty member at Merit, and she's a new faculty member asking, I think this is related to the question, part of the reason minority tax is a tax is because the type of labor involved isn't valued. So mentoring, informally educating, change making, those aren't necessarily things that we can count on a CV. I get that part of being a good ally means ensuring that collaborators get recognition currently meaningful in our system. But I wonder if you have any ideas about how to do the converse, formally valuing the types of contributions often taken up by these faculty members, these students. Like, how do we start to change the system, which I guess is part of your case 3?
Well, I think some of it is creating systems to formally value it. So for instance, in the promotions process, our institution added a diversity statement that's required on the CV. And then people started adding them. And then there was the realization like, oh, now the promotions committees are getting a better sense of what they're looking for in these diversity statements. Let's provide additional structure for what we mean by that or how we might assess them so that people can not only write them better, but really the goal is that they then look at their work every day in anticipation of what am I going to be able to say about my contributions to diversity. So for some people, that means they're adding new work. For others, it means, oh, I was always doing this work and now they're actually looking at it and valuing it. So our Academy of Medical Educators added the same type of thing to their selection process. I think for trainees, you know, how are the selection committees asking about contributions to diversity, equity, and inclusion? Their contributions could be represented if they're given voice to ask. Voice to share what they're doing. So we are definitely trying to think about what are the contributions beyond research. I think that gets to Lara's earlier point that being in an academic center and thinking that research contributions are more important than every other contributions is really a mindset that we need to shift.
Right. It's your comments remind me. So in discussing case 2, you talked about how do we engage those voices that we need in order to push the boundaries on equity, diversity, and inclusion, and creating legitimacy as you say, by making it explicit, putting it in our documents and our policies, and making it and iterating on that. All right, so the first attempt, well, it was better than what we had before, but the second one will be better than that, and so on and so forth, right? Continue evolution. So one of the other pieces that, is part of this for me, especially because we're talking about research, right? That the kinds of knowledge that we try to develop in our research is also, I'm wondering how you feel, because in my mind, the kind of knowledge that we're developing is a part of a reflection of what it is that we espouse in practice. So this idea that if I'm doing a study and there's one answer, there's one external right answer, I can measure it, I can define it, and that's it. I may always maybe getting closer to it, but there's this ideal that exists. And that ideal traditionally has been informed by one way of thinking, one form of appreciation. And one of the things I find very encouraging about medical education is that we tend to have been starting to move towards this idea that there are many different ways of interpreting and experiencing education and reality, many different ways of thinking about what matters and the voices that help us to understand perspectives and those sorts of things. But I find myself often, I'm wondering what your experiences are, because I find myself often struggling with this idea that, well, I want to encourage all kinds of research engagement, but one of them I struggle with because I don't believe in this idea that there's one answer. And at the same time, in the other hand, to try to hold up this idea and value of diversity. They seem to stand in contradiction with each other. Maybe you have a different perspective on it, or I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Well, I think my approach sounds more similar to yours than not. And a counter example would be in our change in clerkship grading, which we did a lot of work to prepare for and evaluate. Some people still come back and say, well, how did your residency match go? And the residency match in the US is very competitive and very stress inducing for the students and very labor intensive for the residency programs on the selection committees. And so some people just want quantitative data about, did anything change and did we hurt our top performers and their chances of getting a really competitive spot? And to my mind, that really doesn't tell the whole story, but I see that that's a valid question to ask, and that some people are more swayed or more compelled by that sort of quantitative data that to them feels more objective. So I think really it would advocate for using a mix of methods and kind of meeting people where they're at in the questions that they're asking, and then maybe they move you a little and you move them.
That speaks back to one of the things you mentioned about in case one, about how increasing diversity was mutually reinforcing with increasing excellence. Could you describe that a little bit more for me? Because there's an argument there that I know I'm going to have to repeat in the near future. And I would just really love to see how you constructed that, or how you saw that in your data, that increasing diversity actually enabled us to better understand and reinforce excellence.
Well, we talked with our students about that in one of our studies, and they said, like, equity is, first of all, doing things well. So if you're assessing people, using best practices in assessment, and like one common example for a student would be, don't assess me on something you didn't watch me do,
Right, yeah.
And then in addition to doing assessment well, the second thing is designing your system, whether it's your curriculum or your assessment, to value the unique contributions that different people are bringing. So in the perspective of assessment of clinical students, they said that's things like my advocacy at the bedside with a family who felt that I was the most important team member because we shared a background, or I spoke their language, or I understood their struggles with this financial issue, or whatever it may be. So it's not just bringing people in and having them adapt to your system. It's thinking, well, how are we adapting to them? And the only way really to know, I think, is starting by listening and asking questions.
I think that really makes a lot of sense for me, especially in the context of all of the things that we've talked about today, but as well in relationship to that question about, or that issue of the minority tax. It's something I've also struggled with, feeling that I don't know enough people, and perhaps I'm tagging the same people too many times for various different things. And it's like, okay, I've got to go and meet more people, and I got to figure out how to do this. And asking questions, one of the things I've been finding myself thinking about is asking different individuals, what, the people that I'm asking for support, for instance, in helping to do this better, what do they want? What would be success for you in terms of your career? And I'll try to find things that align with those. I'll try to ask you, bring requests to you that align with your desires, and not these other ones that you feel you're probably doing too many of already. But again, it's that issue of minority tax. I'm really glad you brought it up, because it's something I struggle with. I have nothing more, I just find it hard. I don't know what to do.
I've been surprised inviting people to be on a research team, the junior faculty, who I think will bring a diverse perspective that will strengthen the work. And I'm trying to push myself out of asking my usual suspects. And most of them have said yes. Often they want to go talk to somebody else first, which I encourage them to do. If you want to talk about this with your mentor, please do. And a lot of them have skills that I didn't know they had. So it gets to our point that you can have research skills, even if you haven't published a lot and show up in PubMed. A lot of people have done some work that contributes a lot to the research team. So it's been a win for sure, all around.
To build on that, some of the skills that they bring are things that I had never thought about, for instance, as being part of the research endeavor, but they absolutely are. So in one of my collaborations, one of my junior faculty is creating this whole website to disseminate different findings. And I'm like, well, that's a great idea that I never would have thought of myself. Like, this just not part of it. Karen, I'm going to hand over back to John, but I just will want to take the last minute of speaker privilege and thank you so much for this very engaging and thought-provoking session today. You've given me a lot of opportunity to think differently and in new ways. So thanks so much.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it, and great discussion here with you and the group.
Let me double down on that and thank both of you, Dr. Hauer, Dr. Varpio. The conversation has really stimulated a lot of thinking I've been wrestling with. More questions, many more questions than answers. I don't think I have easy answers, although there's been some very practical and implementable solutions that I've heard from UCSF that I think we can learn from here in the McMaster community. Before we sign off, I would just direct everybody to submit some feedback on the session today and the conference overall. You'll find a link coming in the chat. We've been very responsive to what are the questions and what are the priorities and how to frame and structure these opportunities for us to engage. And your previous feedback has been very helpful. If you have interest in seeing past presentations or from the PSI Merit Conference on gender in academia or mentoring for inclusiveness, you can find on our YouTube channel previous recorded versions of that. And then of course, I'll invite you back at 4 p.m. To join Dr. Hauer again, Dr. Kathy Risden from the Department of Family Medicine, and Alex Trottier, the Director for the Indigenous Health Learning Lodge, who will be speaking to each other and to us as well as part of a panel on how do we actually go about building support networks so that we can be successful in having academic and research networks that are inclusive of the many voices that make the health professions, education and research environment so interesting and unique. So I'll thank you all. For some of you will be heading off to a small group session where you're going to get to engage with Dr. Hauer in a much more intimate environment. For others, we hope to see you at 4. And for many of you, I hope to see you actually in person. Merit's buying food and drink, and we'd love to connect with you in real life. Take care.